Hey everyone, I am Ben Eubanks, your host, and so glad to have you here for HR Tech Talks. It's going to be a great conversation today. As always, I'm excited to chat with our guest, and we're going to talk about performance and development and all those kinds of things that wrap around how we engage and connect with our people today. I'm really, really pumped. So if you're watching the live stream, glad to have you. Regardless of whether you're watching live stream or catching this later on the replay, take a second in the chat and pop in a word that describes how you describe the performance processes at your company, the performance practices at your company. What's one word you need to describe them? Could be positive, negative, neutral. Doesn't matter to me. I just want to hear from all of you about what you're thinking there, because depending on the company, depending on the example, the experience, where I've been in the past through my career, I could say good things, not so good things. I could use different words to describe that. And so I'd love to hear from you what you'd say if I was going to ask you that one. So I did. I'm excited to have you here as part of the conversation. So to kind of tease, we're going to talk about, we did some research a few years ago, and we saw that 74%, so 3 out of every 4 high-performing companies that we talked to said their approach to performance was a way to improve engagement, drive performance for the company, but also drive performance for the individual people. And low performers in that study said, our process is just kind of a painful thing we let hang around. All right, so that'll tease into something we're going to talk about today. I'm excited to chat with Jack Altman from Lattice, because we're going to talk about how they've been doing this, how they've been serving customers, how they're bringing those kind of things to the table. And it's fun because the company started just in performance, and now they're in growth and development in other areas. And so I'm hoping he'll give us some insight into what they're doing there in the product. So without any further ado, Jack, welcome to the show, sir. Glad to have you.
Thank you. Thrilled to be doing this with you.
Absolutely. So before we dive into some of the fun stuff I've already kind of teased up for the audience, why don't you give us a few minutes or give us a little bit of insight on who Jack is and what you do?
Yeah, absolutely. So the context for this show, I mean, there's always many versions to all of us. The context of me on this show, I think, is I started a company called Lattice coming up on 6 years ago. And what Lattice does today is a broad platform for all sorts of employee management related things. So it's performance management, employee engagement surveys, career development, goal setting, and it's all wrapped up in one so that all of these tools connect. And that's kind of been one of our driving theses of the company, is that we believe that the employee experience is deeply integrated across the way that you're working on your goals, the way that you're performing against your competencies or the things that you're working on from a career perspective, to the way you're engaged in your relationship with your manager and the sort of one-on-ones you have and the feedback you get. And so we wanted to build a tool to reflect that reality, and also to simplify, people leaders' lives, because I think we're sort of living in an age of sprawling SaaS solutions where you go into a company, you see there's hundreds and hundreds, sometimes more than 1,000 tools across a company. A single HR team might have a couple dozen, and it's a lot for employees. So beyond just the employee experience, we thought that would simplify the HR sort of leaders' lives. And one of the big transitions that we've sort of seen as a company at Lattice is this trend towards the employee at the center as opposed to the company at the center. And so all of our products, everything Lattice does, is geared around a world where we believe power sits with the employee, who's the one with all of the choice, the one driving the value for the company. And so if you look back 15, 20 years and how performance management was done then versus sort of what we're trying to stand for today, that difference really is, I would say, described best by, it was all about the company in the past, and it's all about the employee today. So that's what Lattice does. And today we're a few hundred employees, and we're serving a few thousand customers, and we're having a great time.
Awesome. Well, that's fine.
Yeah.
So that gives me some good things to dive into in the conversation, because I'm thinking about a couple of things you talked about there, right? From the employee at the center piece of that, I'm thinking back, right? The more legacy approach, whether it's tools or paper or whatever else, but it's about, let's get completion rates, let's get everybody done and push through and squeeze through this process. It wasn't about how do we use this to help you level up as an individual, right? To whatever your aspirations are, to whatever we need from you, kind of blending those things together. So I love that piece of making that person at the center of it, because that changes the outcomes you're hoping for. That changes the perspective that you're giving this. So I love those pieces of it. One of the things I want to ask you about is culture, right? Because I think that wraps in and around this conversation, and I've got some some stats I could probably throw at you around that what matters, but can you see this across your customer base? Talk about culture in the context of performance and development and engagement. So those things that you do with that customers are using Lattice for, because I would love to hear your perspective on that.
Yeah, and culture is one of these sort of hard to define words and concepts. I think for many of us, it's one of those things that we know it when we see it, even though many of us would struggle to define culture. We would actually mean something very similar if we could find the words for it. And so, like we talk about it in a few ways, but I think at the core of it, it's just what are the ways people behave when sort of no one's looking? What are the sort of norms? What are the practices? How do people treat one another? How do you treat a customer? How do you deal with a work decision that's got obvious trade-offs? And so I think in a lot of different ways, what that culture is really just about who your company is and how does your company behave. I'm a big believer that there's no like correct culture. Like there's not a good type of culture and a bad type of culture. There's just different cultures. And to me, a good culture is an authentic one. It's one where the culture itself can like manifest its own personality, and the people who work at that company feel connected to that broader company personality. And sort of in the same way that like an individual you can like almost anybody as long as they're authentic. I think there's no correct way to be as a person. There's no correct way to be as a company, but everybody does really value authenticity and that alignment and that clarity of your personal why and your company's why. So to me, I think you'll know that you've got a company culture that's working when it feels sort of unforced, when it feels like people can sort of act the way that they naturally would, and it fits in with the overall style of the company. And so there's a lot of different examples we could go into of how that manifests, but to me, that clearly then connects to if I'm able to act authentically and match the company, it's going to be easier for me to perform well, for me to communicate easily, for me to want to stay at the company longer, which is tremendously valuable, for me to have good relationships with others because there's a shared set of norms and understandings of how we work. So that's what it all comes down to me is like authenticity is what leads to a good culture.
I didn't think about this until you started responding to that, but one of the things I'm curious about, I've talked to more and more companies in the last year that are saying, hey, we've started really paying attention to the fact that like there's a culture that we want from a leadership perspective, right? And you are a CEO, so that's probably top of mind for you is what you want people to be doing when you're not looking, when you're not around. Please make the right decisions. But at the same time, every single leader within the organization has a little different style, right? Has a little different way that they approach things, has a way that they lead their people, the way they give them feedback, like all those kinds of things. And so while we have a vision of what we want culture to be and the kind of things we want from a governance perspective, you can be that like rigid about it. There's also these like pockets within the organization of different ways people lead, different things people need. And I've seen lots of examples, I'm sure you have as well, of how that looks. And I was going to ask a question and I totally blanked on what the question is. What are your thoughts on that as kind of a conversation within culture? Because like you have that as a leader, but how do you also make sure that the people that you're leading throughout the organization are also prioritizing the right kinds of things?
Yeah, well, there's good differences and there's bad differences. Like you don't actually part of a company's strength in many cases is the very fact that people in the company behave differently. Similarly to a family or a school or a city, it's not like you want a bunch of clones who are all acting exactly the same. That those differences in the way people behave is actually very valuable when you think about it for an employee. Let's say I work in marketing, it's still interesting and useful for me if I can learn from a head of sales who has a certain style or interact with a head of product who has a certain style or, throughout the company, there's actually a lot of value in my view to having people who have different leadership styles, different management styles. And there's a lot of different ways that can be effective. You'll see some managers who their style, which is tremendously effective, is that they will push people harder than they thought they could, but they know kind of how to stop them from crossing that line. And as a result, they get these amazing results from people who are pretty tired, but it's like they're guiding people to climb Everest a little bit before they're ready. And they were exhausted along the way, but at the end they're like, wow, I climbed Everest. And for some people, that's a beautiful thing. For other managers, their style is much more one of cheerleading and support and keeping up energy, and and that can be a very positive and effective style too. And there's plenty of others. And so, to me, it's about having the right brew. And I think where it goes wrong, and this is where I think things like mission and values really matter, is you still need the same fundamental ideals. Like, I think this, I certainly don't want to get into politics at all, but when you think about like America or something like that, there are very different views within America, even when it's functioning at its very best. But there's still a common set of values and ideals, and I think that is sort of analogous, where you want there to be commonalities and fundamental baselines that we all agree on across a company, about how we behave and what we prioritize and what we believe in. But beyond that, I think you actually want the diversity of behavior.
Awesome. I love that. So one of the last companies I worked in when I was in HR before I transitioned out into the world that I'm in now, that was one of the things that was a challenge for me. Is the CEO was like, hey, this is the thing. These are the values that matter most to us as the company. Like, we had to make sure these are the priority. But then we had engineers, or software engineers. We had very, very technical people. We had people who trained helicopter pilots who were not technical in in a different kind of sense. And so it was really, the challenge was making sure every leader didn't feel like they're drained to this box of everybody's got to be right a cookie cutter. We've got to use these things, but also flow it into however you get your work done, how you manage your team, how you recognize performance, how you give feedback to your people. All those things can be wrapped into this so that they know the right direction to go, but they also are able to do that without you having to keep your thumb on them at all times and having to kind of feel controlled in some way. So with you on that one. Absolutely. Okay. So we talked about culture a little bit. We talked about performance just a bit. One of the things I wanted to make sure we get to is the growth piece. You talked about competencies earlier, right? Having people make sure they're on the right plan for their career. Talk about that as part of this bigger conversation, because when I was working in HR years ago, that was always like a side or an additional conversation. Someone had to request that as an extra discussion as part of performance. And today I'm feeling like it's increasingly becoming a standard part of, here's a performance component, but also here's the development piece.
Yep. Yeah. A refrain that I started hearing a lot in workplaces like a few years ago was employees who had been, in the workforce for 10, 20 years, complaining about employees who had been in the workforce for, say, 6, 12 months, because those newer employees were so focused on, well, what's my next promotion going to be? And when do I get a raise? And how do I become a manager? And these older employees were like, well, geez, back in my day, that wasn't how we were just grateful to have the job. And now these kids are coming in and they're entitled, and, and the world, so, and I heard that a lot. And what I thought was, and, I sort of straddle, I'm a millennial. I think I can identify with sort of both of those mental models. Just like, I can just as easily any given day think, yes, I can do anything, versus, gosh, people need to, it's hard work to get places.
Buckle down. Yeah.
Yeah. And I can relate to both of those very easily. And the prevailing thought that I've always had was, well, you can try to complain about that dynamic and you can fight it, or you can try to understand it and channel it. And I do think we're living in a world where people are expecting more growth more quickly than people did in the past. I think people see examples of people's careers taking off. I think people see paths that allow for people to be tremendously successful in a compressed period of time. And so it's only natural that everyone would look at those examples and think, well, what does it take for me to do that? And I think in many ways, that's actually a really positive thing. You've got a lot of ambitious, people who want to, figure out how to, get ahead at work really quickly. And I think that's a great thing. So to me, the right response to that changed world, where you do have a lot more employees with a lot more ambition a lot earlier, is neither to just throw out promotions that don't make sense to appease people, nor is it to tell people, just stop expecting so much, what's wrong with you? I think there's actually something very powerful you can do that combines those and channels all of that ambition, where you say, this is what it takes to get to what you're asking about. You've been out of school for a year. This is your first workplace. You're asking to become a manager? Great. Let me really articulate for you and show you and describe to you what those skills and abilities are that will make you successful in that role. And then let's talk about a path to get there. And if you want to get there fast, I, as your manager, am going to be behind you. I'm going to coach you. I'm going to work with you, but I'm not going to give it to you before you're ready. And you have that really honest conversation. And to me, that's what employee development is about. It's about, people are on this path in their career, and it's about shining a light ahead of them and showing them this is what it takes and this is how you get there, but you still got to get there.
So a couple of things, because that's a great way of putting it. And I had forgotten about this. We just gathered some recent data, actually. So forgot about this. I would have prepped you with it so we could have discussed it more fully. But we actually asked North American European workers about their preferences for skills, the preferences for development, those kinds of things. And what we found in general is someone who is earlier in their career, younger overall, right? They're more likely to say, hey, the company needs to be telling me what to do. They need to take some ownership over this, right? I own part of it, but they own a big chunk too. Whereas someone who has more experience in the workplace, someone that's been around for a while, they're seasoned, they're more likely to say, my company plays a part, but this is on me primarily. This is on my shoulders to be able to figure this out and decide what I want to do. And again, I don't think it's one's right and the other's wrong. It's somewhere in the middle there. And it's partially, you sort of ambition. And I never stopped to think about it that way. But when we think about like the 9 box, it's performance versus potential. And it's almost becomes like performance versus ambition. Someone really is ambitious. They often end up in the top end of that box, right? Because they're not just performing well, but they also want to be something else. They have a plan for their future somewhere along the line. And so I've never heard someone use the word ambition there, but I'm going to start maybe flexing that into that conversation. So it's not just performance or potential there.
And I think ambition it's a great thing. It's a root of motivation. It's a root of people wanting to grow. It's a root of them wanting to improve. Like when you think about, all of this stuff at work and you've got these levels for what, like, why should they care? Why not just stay comfortable? And why not just keep doing what they're doing? There are so many people who, if they wanted to, could just say, you know what, software engineer level 3, I'm good. I don't need to keep pushing. And you do occasionally see that. You do occasionally see somebody at some point in their career say, I love my current scope of role. I love being a manager of 8 customer success employees, or I love being a front-end engineer who does these things. And that's awesome. And there's totally nothing wrong with that. And in my view, companies should 100% make room for people who do what they're doing, love what they're doing, and don't want to progress in any particular direction. I think that's completely fine. But more often than not, you will see employees have a desire to continue on some career path, and that to me is that ambition is what that is rooted in.
There's a company that I talk about when I present on this topic, because it's something that's near and dear to my heart, right? I mean, I always encourage people to find the role for them, and that's so much fun for you. Again, that's something I'll talk about, is those people who are happy where they are. Don't push them to leave. Don't push them to do something else. That person, hey, you're phenomenal at sales. I'm going to take you out of sales, which you love and are great at. And I'll put you over here managing people who are doing that job you used to love. And
totally.
The data show you're likely to be very terrible at it, and you'll hate it and you'll leave and go find a sales position somewhere else.
That's right.
We do that all the time, even though we absolutely should not. And it's just one of those things we kind of like, well, that's how it is. And I had someone ask me that recently who's a manager who saw this happen in his own company. He's like, why don't we have like a solution for this? And I don't know. I think part of it comes back to, we've got to have the tools in place to help us have better conversations, but we've also got to have managers who are willing to talk to people and to push back on someone else. It's like, hey, we really need them moved over here. Like that's not where Jack doesn't want to do that. Don't make Jack go there, or Jack will find some other place to work if we make him go there.
And part of that too, and this is where maybe it goes back to your earlier point, is that it's not all of this career stuff is neither just the employee nor is it just the company. Like, in order to foster a company where people are not feeling like, if I want to be successful here, I have to become a manager. You see this all the time where it often feels like that's the only way up. Even though the truth is, for many companies, a really talented engineer or talented salesperson, the company is willing to and should compensate that person more than a sales manager or an engineering manager. Those roles are often harder to find and more valuable. And so as a result, like they should pay more. But I think companies often get to a point where they've structured everything such that the only way up is via management. And I think that is a huge miss. I think you as a company need to see that issue for what it is. And then you need to do practical things to not just say it's great if you want to stay as an individually contributing engineer, salesperson, marketer, but you need to like walk the walk with real levels. And this is why I think levels and ladders are a wonderful thing, where you can be individual contributor level 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. You can be manager level 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And if you are an IC level 7 and you decide I really want to be a manager for the first time, understanding that okay, but you're going to go manager level 1 unless you've got some prior skills. And here's that trade-off, and the company reflecting all of that. So I think this requires the company to be really thoughtful about designing pathways for people that reflect, multiple career paths that can be successful.
It almost feels like in some cases you're forced to give up those things that got you to where you are, the things that are the skills that have mattered the most and that people have paid you the most for in the past, in order to take one of those other kinds of, you have to give that part of yourself up. And that's a terrible trade-off. One of the things we did in a previous company is we actually set up for those technical people that didn't want to be, there's some options, right? We had someone who had started out technical, but she didn't want to be technical long-term, right? So the opposite end of the spectrum, maybe we had offered a technical program sort of role so she could become a leader of other technical people. And that's what she loved and was excited about. And that gave her a place to blossom and be creative. Right? If we had said, no, you have to be a 3, 4, and 5 software engineer, she would have found some other place again. And so one of the things that is always on the back of my mind is you and I are talking about all these kind of big picture practices and things, but the people who are least likely to put up with one of those forced changes or forced directions are your high performers. The people who are doing the best. They have the most options. And if we try to force that on them, they're the first one to say, it's okay, I got 2 job offers. I've been kind of keeping warm over here. I'm out. Thanks.
Absolutely.
Goodness. All right. So one of the other things I want to ask you about is, you mentioned earlier on, you've got thousands of customers, lots of great stories. And one of the things that I see kind of covering the technology market is companies who are looking for a more modern approach to performance and engagement, right? Those kinds of things that you're offering with Lattice. Those companies often have a little more innovative and approaches overall and thinking around that. So I don't know if you have an example kind of in your back pocket of something that you've seen as a trend or an approach across your customer base, but I'd love to hear what's working in that space, because if you talk about performance, everyone's got an opinion on it, but I'd love to hear from you because you're actually seeing some data, some examples across that spectrum.
Yeah. And I think one of the other interesting things that I've noticed over the years is that the companies who are at the front edge of thinking about performance management and engagement and feedback and how to design these systems, beyond just having one innovative idea, they actually have an entire mindset of willingness to update thinking and adapt and iterate. And those companies you'll see not just do performance management the same way year after year after year, because that's what they've always done and that's what they believe, that's what they were taught to do and so forth, but they actually will. I remember this one customer who always told me they would do the performance review. They would immediately after, a week after, do a survey to the company about the performance review and get feedback on all these detailed things. Mm-hmm. And then they would quickly commit to how they were going to update the performance review for the next cycle. And so sometimes that meant doing it more or less frequently. Sometimes that meant doing ratings in certain ways. Sometimes that means doing, anonymous 360 versus non-anonymous 360, all sorts of updates, but to listen to your employees' feedback. And it's not about just doing exactly what employees are telling you, but it's about mixing that with what you think is going to be valuable and get you the results you want. But being willing to update your performance management every single cycle, I remember hearing that and thinking, wow, that's what a wonderful way to be.
Intense.
Yeah, it's intense. But if you think 10 years forward, and is company A who is willing to update their review cycle every time after doing a survey, is that company or company B who says, this is how we do performance management. We're just going to mostly stick with this. And this is our process. Who in the year 2030 do you think is going to have a better system? Like clearly the group that's iterating, and they're going to make some mistakes along the way and they're going to have some issues, but that willingness to listen to employee feedback, to think from first principles frequently about the process because it's so impactful to people. I think that's what a wonderful way to be.
There's an experiment done a while back. I'm going to connect it back to that because I think that's a great approach. Just be willing to experiment, right, and innovate there. This professor said, okay, two groups of students, you're going to build the best pot you can build, right? Clay, pottery, whatever. One group said you study everything you can study, and then in 30 days, you're going to build the best one you can make. And the other group, it was, you're going to keep trying every day. You're going to make as many as you want to make. You're going to keep trying and testing and figuring out, and then you present the best one. And inevitably, the second group presented the best ones because they've been trying and experimenting. And this didn't work out. Let's stay away from that. Or, hey, this is actually the best way to make that work. And the group that just did it once, even if that second group you're talking about, we're going to make one big change to our process and then just adhere to that. That still doesn't lead to the best results long term because you're finding out these little pieces of what works, what doesn't work over time. But just being willing to iterate is something we always look for. Like, what's the secret? What's the best? Like one practice. And if I'm hearing you right, it's like there's not one thing. It's be willing to try what your people need to lead to the best outcomes for them.
Yes, and the full cycle is high willingness to iterate and then high willingness to update, which comes from things like you need like no pride and ownership of creation, low ego, willingness to like adapt, say that something didn't work well. And so I think it's the combination of those two where you're simultaneously willing to try new things and then very willing to change what you had, which by the way is not just for a system like performance management. I actually think that combo is one of the most predictive things of somebody's overall career growth is how able are they to keep trying new things, learning, growing, and then adapting and shedding what didn't work and, having no sense that I need to stick with what I did in the past. I think that is like one of the defining characteristics of people I've seen who grow really quickly.
Ooh, bonus points for bringing that back around to an individual level. I like that. Just when I think about the people I've worked with, the ones who I'm like, man, if I could just be a little more like them, those are some of the things they do. You think, well, they just had that. It's not that they had one big creative idea and suddenly they were done. It's they built this habit over time of thinking about those kind of things. And when you said a minute ago, 10 years from now, what's going to happen? I thought of the Bill Gates quote: "You always overestimate what you'll do in 1 year and underestimate what you can do in 10 years."
Yeah.
Long term, we can have if you got 1%, 2%, 3% better every single year in how you're approaching this, 10 years from now, that's a tremendous step in the right direction versus just either holding on or we're going to make one change and get that 3% improvement and then just hold on to that long term. Totally. You're missing out there. So, I feel like I have so many more questions, but we're getting close to the end here. So if someone is listening, they want to know more at Lattice and what the team is doing, how you're serving customers, what's the best way for them to connect with the company or connect with you? It doesn't matter. Learn more about what Lattice is up to.
To connect with the company, if you just go to our website and request time and chat with somebody, that's a super easy way to do it. We've also got a Slack community called Resources for Humans, which you can also find on the group. And so if you're not looking to chat with Lattice directly, you can join the Slack community. We got 10,000 something people leaders in there just talking about all sorts of stuff. And if people want to reach out to me for whatever reason, I'm just jack@lattice.com. Awesome.
Wonderful. And so the website is lattice.com. Feel free to check it out, connect with the team there. They're doing good work in the space. And as you can hear right there, there's not one single way to do it. And so I think you'd enjoy a conversation with the team. Jack, this has been a fun experience for me. I appreciate your time, sir, and your expertise. Thank you so much for hanging out with us.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. This was great. Really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Awesome. Wonderful. To everybody else, I hope you enjoyed the conversation with Jack and the team over at Lattice. They're doing good work. And you heard how to connect with them there. As he mentioned, gave it his own email address even. Feel free to follow up with them. If you're curious, you want to know more, you're looking at this. I talked to a company just 2 weeks ago in the healthcare space that's looking for a new approach to this because they said that the way we're doing it isn't leading to the right results. So it's about the outcomes. And again, as you heard from Jack, making it employee focused, making the employee the center of this. It's not about giving up what the company needs, but it's about helping the employee to play a bigger part across the spectrum and leading to those outcomes you're looking for. So thank you for hanging out with us. catch you again next week on HR Tech Talks. Actually, no, this week we have a special edition on Wednesday of HR Tech Talks, 11 a.m. as Central as normal, same time Wednesday with a special edition. But then next week we'll catch you again with another innovative company in our space. Thank you so much for hanging out. I appreciate you, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week.